of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to Marlene and the Society for inviting me. I'm honoured to be here and thoroughly enjoying the conference. You'll note I'm not using high-tech whiz-bang audiovisual aids. I'm quite glad you took the Finches down because, well, we are moving away from really multiple births, and it certainly didn't reflect the state of midwifery staffing that branch. So I would have difficulty speaking relevantly to the Happy Finch family. But I'm not using high-tech aids because they are not appropriate to my subject. And much of what I want to say is about appropriateness. So please listen, because this does not come with a visual printout. Birth is about relationships, fundamentally. It's obviously about a mother's relationship with her baby, which does not start with the first scan, although often things are promoted in that sense. It's about relationships within the family, and I'm more and more aware of, as I do more research and as I read more research, of the wide family network that informs women's choices around their births. Women have a much wider remit in terms of family health than those who immediately care for them. It's about the relationship between the midwife and the mother. And we know that a supportive companion in labour can really improve outcomes. And this knowledge is applied in the original model of active management of labour, though often those who follow didn't take this important bit of the formula. It's applied by independent midwives, it's applied by the doula profession, but sadly in these times of economic stringency and shortage of staff, it's not applied in a lot of models of care in between. But we do know that if supportive continuous care in labour was a technological device or a drug, it will be promoted to be well nigh compulsory because its outcomes are exemplary. Birth is always also about a woman's relationship with herself. And as Barbara Cathrothman said rather more eloquently than I can, birth is not just about the birth of a baby, it's the birth of a mother. And we want that to be the birth of a strong, competent, resourceful mother. And all these things start in labour. And calmness and confidence, we all know as midwives, are highly infectious. If we are calm and confident in labour, the mother will be too, because we model for her. The opposite of that is also true, and stress and fear are highly infectious in labour. And we know that maternal stress and fear have a very adverse effect on blood flow to the placenta. The science of that has been worked on. So we do have fundamental duties to promote calmness and confidence and support, as well as many others. As well as being about relationships, birth is about the entry to society. And the entry to any society is guarded by that society's values. And our society's values are very technological on all sides. And it's great that many women are having babies now who would not have successfully had babies previously, even within my career as a midwife. So we have a spiralling need for medical intervention. And as Professor Jim Dornan said last night, we are there for the survival of the weak and not just the strongest. So that's great. But we have to see this in the perspective which our profession gives us as midwives. Because we're also in a society that is risk-aware, risk-averse, very fearful of birth. I mean, we do now have studies across sort of 25 years which show that fear of birth is rising, even though the risks in many ways are falling. And I read this wonderful phrase used by a French-Canadian GP obstetrician recently, who described fear as the Muzak, which accompanies all aspects of obstetric services. And sadly, I thought, what a spot-on phrase. And you can't get away from the Muzak nowadays. It's another aspect of our modern technology. So risk is part of how society sees the world, but risk is not a place of no return. and I think this is very important. It's far too simplistic to say we must define the high risk and give them to the obstetricians and say, here you are, mate, sort them. Risk is dynamic. People move into and out of risks. I'm going back to Sheffield later today, and my risks as a traveller will change as I move from this hall to taxi, to plane, to train, to taxi, and finally land up in my own bed. And, we journey through risk, and a lot of people will do their best to lower my risk at every step today. And so it is around birth that women move into, and there's lots we can do to move them out of many risks. And I'm interested in the path out of risk. I'm interested in what we can do technologically in prevention as well as in diagnosis. And we also have to say we live in a particular economic society which affects the entry to society, and money is to be made from technology. There's no way away from that. It is. Whereas the staffing of midwives is an expense and a terrible waste of the nation's resources if there's too many of us. But, buying tools somehow kickstarts the economy. So there's all sorts of things there. Maybe if we, could be reclassified as devices rather than women, then maybe somebody would sponsor us and everything would be economically different. But we live in the society we live in, and that society guards its entrance, and that's only right. So technology is defined as the branch of knowledge that deals with the mechanical arts or the applied sciences. And the mechanical arts are very important. Now, I am so vastly old as a midwife. I trained in the days when we had to chant the mechanisms of labour, and we had to know the average dimensions of bits of the pelvis. And although I'm not sure that, apart from religious aspects, chanting is necessarily highly educational, it is very useful to really, really know your mechanisms. There's no way round that. The mechanics are important. And if you talk to the midwives now who have kept the torch burning for vaginal breech births, they do know their physiology. And I think there's something we can all learn from them, that we neglect the fundamental mechanics of the business. Sociology is not a substitute for knowing your mechanisms. And I can say that because I am a sociologist amongst other trades. So we need to understand the physiology as well as a great many other things. But technology is not seen in our society as being about knowledge. It's seen as being about tools. And the more sophisticated the tools, the more status they give to those who wield them. Now, midwifery is a largely female profession, and women and midwives have had a troubled historical relationship with tools. And I'm sure we've all had various interesting relationships with various tools over the course of our lives. And I've done a lot of historical reading about this, and it saddens me that every time I read something historical which explains about some midwife long ago actually using tools, I take it to her historian colleague, who always tells me that source is very doubtful, really, Mavis. You should be reading that for pleasure rather than seeing it's a historical reference. So I can't say I found a lot historically on midwives and tools, but I go on looking. But it has to be said that the barbers and their like, and who evolved, of course, into the surgeons, have cherished their monopoly and have built walls around it until relatively recently. So, talking about tools, there's fundamentally, I feel, two sorts as far as we're concerned. There's the tools that change things, which were seen as terribly secret. The obstetricians who, long ago, had those special pockets in their trouser legs for concealing forceps blades so nobody could see what the patent instrument actually looked like. Which does make you wonder about the hygiene, but nevertheless, it was pre-knowledge of the technology of germs. The Vectis, which was like a single forceps blade, which is nice because it's actually been researched at the minute. The scalpel, the drugs that bring about chemical change, these are all tools that directly change things. And then we have the tools that measure, the counting that Jim Dornan talked about most eloquently last night. that we count and we look for patterns. The multiple bits of antenatal screening counting that we do now, the counting of the fetal heart, and fashions change in what we count. I can remember when pelvimetry was a science of infinitely, vastly important counting. It isn't anymore. And there is, of course, an overlap between those that change and those that count. Because if you count in a way that's intrusive, you'll frighten women so much, you'll get phenomenal chemical change, and then you're into the infectious fear and panic, which has terrible consequences. But there are problems with measuring because we do get quite hooked on it, and the only point of measurement is to be able to predict. But then, of course, we create averages, and then it's so nice if you can sort of bend everybody to fit the averages. And, you know, the tools that measure do lead on to all sorts of other things. And it's always a great pleasure to me to have someone with me at a home birth who is used to practicing in hospital. And when the woman's, you know, not contracting every 2 minutes for 40 seconds, and the person who's used to hospital is getting panicked, I can explain that actually that's not what you have to do. All you have to do is have the baby. And if you have the baby and the baby is healthy and the mother is healthy, and you've never had contractions more frequently than 5 minutes, well, what does it matter? But so we have, you know, we have produced an average and rather tried to force women into it. I want to point out, because it's so fundamental as to be invisible, the fundamental, all-pervading technology which has so deeply invaded our consciousness, which is the clock. We can't think without it, we can't imagine labour without it. We could not do the documentation we are legally required to do in labour without it. We would not, without a clock, know how to start to write up a labour. But believe me, it's a very powerful technology, so you let us not be critical of more modern and scientific things when we think of the labour ward clock. And also the calendar, because there's an awful lot of things we do by the calendar which we've got precious little evidence for. And we need to see the clock and the calendar in context. I was practicing a few months ago in Ethiopia, and believe me, the time frame is different if you're hundreds of kilometres from any medical aid, and when you get there, they've no power to refrigerate and no power to do surgery, but it's hundreds of kilometres further over their sort of very treacherous, very precipitous terrain. Your time frames should be very, very different from what they are in a modern labour ward. So we always must see things in their geographical and their social context. And the social context there, of course, is I found one of the most important things one could do as an outside volunteer is help in the whip round for the transport, because that's what saves lives. I also want to remind you that technology is relatively new in midwifery, and I've got a personal measure of this because I taught a woman on a return to midwifery practice course. Not 1,000 years ago, not at the beginning of my own practice, but I had occasion to teach this woman to take a blood pressure, because when she'd originally practiced as a midwife, that was solely the doctor's domain. So between us, her and my very overlapping careers actually go back to the time when midwives did not take blood pressure. A lot has happened technologically, and it's happened very fast. Technology gives status, and the great thing that gave obstetrics real status was becoming a surgical specialism. And as Brigitte Jordan said, technology carries in its wake a hierarchy of technological expertise. And midwives have been very eager to take on technical tasks because they have really enhanced our professional status. And this whole thing about technology and status is actually very fraught. And if you read the documents around